I remember the moment the doors of my courtroom opened that morning. Not with the usual quiet compliance, not with the hesitant shuffle of someone burdened by consequence, but with a kind of presence that felt forced, loud even in silence, as though arrogance itself had learned how to walk on polished marble floors. And I watched from my bench as she entered, draped in luxury so excessive it bordered on theatrical. A tailored cream suit that clung to her frame with deliberate precision, a designer handbag dangling carelessly from her wrist as though it were weightless, oversized sunglasses still resting on her face despite the clear indoor lighting. And I remember thinking, not for the first time in my career, that some people walk into court believing they are stepping onto a stage, not into a place where truth strips everything away. Her heels clicked, slow, deliberate, each step echoing in a rhythm that seemed almost defiant. And when she finally stopped before the defense table, she did not remove her glasses immediately. No. She took her time, tilting her head slightly, scanning the room with a faint smirk, as if measuring its worth against her own inflated sense of self. And I felt it then, that familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but recognition. Because I have seen many cases, countless faces, decades of arrogance paraded before me, but there is a specific kind of entitlement that announces itself before a single word is spoken, and she carried it like a crown. And when she finally lowered those glasses, revealing eyes that held no humility, no concern, no awareness of where she stood, only impatience, I leaned back slightly in my chair, fingers interlaced, watching her in silence, letting that silence stretch, because silence in my courtroom has weight, and I wanted her to feel it, but she didn't. She simply rolled her shoulders back, glanced briefly at her attorney, who already looked exhausted, and then, astonishingly, she sighed, audibly, as if this entire proceeding were nothing more than an inconvenience interrupting her day. And that was the moment I knew this was not going to be a simple case. I glanced down at the file placed neatly before me, a thin folder, deceptively simple, and I remember thinking how often the smallest files carry the heaviest truths. My fingers rested on its edge for a moment longer than usual, a habit I've developed over the years. A pause, a moment to center myself before opening the story contained within. And as I flipped it open, the first thing that struck me was the number: $14,200 unpaid parking and traffic citations, accumulated over time. My eyes moved slowly across the documented entries, date after date, violation after violation, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, but together they formed something else entirely, a pattern, a disregard, a quiet, persistent refusal to respect the law. And I lifted my gaze from the file, meeting her eyes again. She didn't flinch, didn't even pretend to care. Instead, she shifted her weight, crossing her arms loosely, her posture radiating that same careless superiority. And I could feel my jaw tighten slightly, because I have seen people break under the weight of a single ticket. I have seen individuals lose sleep, lose dignity, lose stability over far less. And yet here she stood, owing an amount that could change someone's life, and treating it like pocket change, like a clerical error, like something beneath her attention. And I leaned forward, just slightly, my voice calm, measured, but carrying that unmistakable authority that fills every corner of my courtroom. "Ma'am, do you understand why you are here today?" I asked. A simple question, one I have asked thousands of times. But this time I watched her closely, because something told me her answer would not be simple, and she didn't disappoint. She let out a soft laugh, barely contained, tilting her head again as if amused by the very premise of the question, and replied, "Honestly, not really. This seems a bit excessive for parking tickets." And there it was, that tone, dismissive, almost bored. And I felt it then, that shift within me, that quiet, controlled fire beginning to build. Because this wasn't just about tickets anymore. Her attorney leaned in quickly, whispering something urgent, his hand subtly gesturing for restraint. but she waved him off with a flick of her wrist, not even looking at him. And I watched that interaction carefully because it told me more than any document could. It told me she was used to control, used to being the loudest voice in the room, used to bending situations to her will simply by refusing to acknowledge their gravity. And I have seen that before, many times. But what I also saw, what lingered at the edge of my awareness, was something else. Something that didn't quite fit the picture she was presenting. Because as I turned another page in the file, I noticed a name. Not hers, not her attorney's, but someone else entirely, listed repeatedly alongside the citations. And I paused, just for a moment, my fingers hovering over the paper as my mind began to piece together fragments, because this wasn't adding up. Not yet. And I could feel the tension in the room begin to shift. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. The kind of shift that happens when something unseen begins to surface. And I leaned back again, studying her face. The confidence, the impatience, the complete absence of concern. And I thought to myself, you have no idea. Not yet. And slowly, deliberately, I closed the file, letting the soft sound echo in the quiet courtroom. And I said, we're going to take this one step at a time. My voice steady, controlled, but carrying a weight she still didn't recognize. And as I looked at her, really looked at her, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case, this seemingly simple collection of unpaid tickets, was about to become something far more significant, something that would strip away every layer of arrogance she had walked in with. And I was ready, because in my courtroom, truth doesn't rush. It reveals itself, slowly, painfully, and when it does, it leaves nothing untouched. The first citation dated back nearly 3 years. I remember tracing the ink with my eyes, letting the timeline unfold in my mind like a slow, deliberate unraveling. 1 ticket became 2, 2 became 10, 10 became dozens, each one issued under circumstances that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. Expired meters, unauthorized parking zones, violations that most people would address immediately. But not in this case, no. In this case, each citation had been ignored, deliberately, repeatedly, and I felt a growing unease as I turned each page, because patterns like this don't happen by accident. They are choices, sustained, intentional choices. And I looked up again, my gaze settling on her with renewed focus. You've accumulated these over a significant period of time, I said slowly, my tone still measured but carrying a sharper edge now. Can you explain why none of these were addressed? And she shrugged, actually shrugged, a casual lift of her shoulders as if I had asked her about the weather. I travel a lot. Things slip through the cracks, she replied, her voice light, almost dismissive. And I felt something inside me harden just slightly, because I have heard every excuse imaginable. I have listened to stories of hardship, of loss, of circumstances beyond control, but this was not that. This was indifference. And indifference, in the face of responsibility, is something I do not tolerate easily. And her attorney, visibly tense now, attempted to interject. Your Honor, my client has been... But she cut him off again, this time with a slight laugh. It's not that serious, she said. And that moment, it lingered, because the room itself seemed to react. A subtle shift, a collective awareness that something was wrong, deeply wrong. And I leaned forward once more, my voice dropping slightly, quieter, but far more dangerous in its calm. Not that serious, I repeated, letting the words hang, letting her hear them in the silence that followed. Because sometimes repetition carries more weight than volume, and I could see it then, just for a fraction of a second, a flicker in her eyes. Not fear, not yet, but uncertainty. And I knew we were getting closer. As the details continued to unfold, the name that had caught my attention earlier began to appear more frequently. An elderly man, 86 years old, legally blind, and I felt the air in my lungs still for just a moment as that realization settled in, because suddenly, this wasn't about negligence, this wasn't about forgetfulness, this was something else entirely. And I looked back down at the file, reading more carefully now. Each citation linked not to her directly, but to a vehicle registered under his name, and I felt a slow, deliberate anger begin to rise, controlled, contained, but undeniable, because I have seen exploitation before. I have seen the vulnerable used as shields, as tools, as means to avoid accountability, and every single time, it leaves a mark. And I lifted my gaze again, this time sharper, more focused. "Who is this individual?" I asked, tapping the page lightly. And she hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough, because hesitation in a room like this speaks volumes. "He's a relative," she replied, her tone slightly less certain now, and I felt that shift again, that tightening, because something wasn't right. And I leaned in further, my eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that left no room for evasion. "A relative who is legally blind and 86 years old, and yet somehow responsible for over $14,000 in traffic violations?" I asked, each word deliberate, precise. And the silence that followed, it stretched, heavy, suffocating, because now the truth was beginning to surface, and she could feel it. Her attorney stepped in quickly this time, his voice strained, attempting to regain control of a situation that was clearly slipping. "Your Honor, if I may—" But I raised a hand slightly, not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough. And he stopped. Because there are moments in a courtroom when interruption is not just unnecessary, it is inappropriate. And this was one of them. I kept my eyes on her, unwavering, because this was the moment where pretense begins to crack, where arrogance meets reality. And I asked the question, the one that would change everything. Slow, deliberate, each word placed with precision. How does a blind, elderly man accumulate this many driving violations? And I watched her, every movement, every breath, because the answer to that question, it wasn't just about facts, it was about truth. And for the first time since she had walked into my courtroom, she didn't have one. And in that silence, in that heavy, unavoidable silence, I felt it, the shift, the beginning of the end of her control. And I knew. This case was about to reveal something far deeper, far more disturbing than anyone in that room had anticipated. The courtroom, once filled with that faint undercurrent of impatience she had carried in with her, now felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the tension that had begun to seep into every corner. And I remained still, my posture firm, my gaze unbroken, watching as she struggled, subtly at first, to maintain that same composure she had so confidently displayed just minutes earlier. Her fingers, once relaxed, now gripped the edge of the table ever so slightly, not enough for most to notice. But I noticed, I always notice, because it is in these small fractures that the truth begins to breathe. And I let the silence continue, stretching it deliberately, allowing it to settle over her, to press against her, to demand something she was no longer prepared to give. And I thought back briefly to the many years I have spent on this bench, to the countless individuals who have stood where she stood, some broken before they spoke, some defiant until the very end, but all of them eventually faced the same reality, that this room does not bend, it does not yield, it reveals. And as I watched her swallow, her confidence wavering just enough to betray the first signs of discomfort, I spoke again, my voice lower now, quieter, but carrying an authority that did not need volume to command attention. "I'm going to ask you again," I said slowly, each word deliberate, measured. "How does a man who cannot see commit repeated driving violations?" And this time, the question did not hang unanswered out of arrogance. It lingered because she had nowhere left to hide. And I could see it. the realization dawning behind her eyes that whatever version of this story she had prepared, it was no longer enough. And in that moment, I knew we were no longer dealing with excuses. We were uncovering something far more serious, something that would not end quietly, something that would demand accountability, whether she was ready for it or not. For a moment, she said nothing, absolutely nothing. And I watched that silence take hold of her in a way that no argument, no lawyer, no rehearsed excuse ever could. Her lips parted slightly, as if words were forming somewhere behind them but refused to emerge. And her eyes, those once sharp, dismissive eyes, began to shift. Not wildly, not dramatically, but just enough to betray that something inside her was no longer aligned with the confidence she had walked in with. And I leaned back slowly, my gaze never leaving her, allowing that silence to stretch further, because silence, when it is deserved, becomes its own kind of pressure. And I remember thinking, this is where the truth starts to push back. This is where the mask begins to crack. And finally, she exhaled, a shallow, uneven breath, and said, I wasn't the one driving. Her voice quieter now, stripped of that earlier arrogance. And I felt it immediately, that shift, because the tone had changed, but the responsibility had not yet followed. And I tilted my head slightly, studying her, my fingers resting lightly on the bench. Then who was? I asked, simple, direct, unavoidable. And again that hesitation, longer this time, heavier, until she finally muttered, the car is in his name, but I use it. And there it was, the first fragment of truth, incomplete, insufficient, but real. And I felt a slow, controlled anger begin to settle deeper within me, not explosive, not reckless, but steady, because I have seen this before. The shifting of burden onto those who cannot defend themselves, the quiet manipulation of vulnerability for convenience. And I did not interrupt her. I let her continue, because when people begin to unravel, you do not rush them. You let them reveal themselves completely, and she did, slowly, painfully, piece by piece. I remember glancing down at the file again, this time not as a collection of violations, but as evidence of something far more deliberate. Each ticket now carrying a different weight, because it was no longer about parking. It was about pattern, about intent, about choice. And I began to read them aloud, one by one, each date, each location, each fine, my voice steady, unwavering, filling the courtroom with a rhythm that felt almost surgical, precise, methodical. March 14th, unauthorized parking in a disabled zone. June 2nd, expired registration. August 19th, blocking a fire lane. And with each entry, I watched her, her posture tightening, her eyes lowering just slightly more each time, because repetition has power. It forces confrontation. It removes the ability to dismiss. And when I finally closed the file again, the sound seemed louder than before, sharper, final. And I leaned forward, my voice no longer just calm but firm, grounded in something deeper. So let me understand this clearly, I said, my gaze locking onto hers once more. You used a vehicle registered under the name of an 86-year-old legally blind man, accumulated over $14,000 in violations, and made no effort to resolve them. Is that correct? And she nodded, barely. A small, reluctant movement. And in that moment, the courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, because now the truth was no longer hidden. It was exposed, undeniable, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on everything, including her. Her attorney tried again, his voice strained, almost pleading now. Your Honor, my client, but I stopped him, not with anger, not with volume, but with presence. A slight raise of my hand, a look that carried decades of authority, and he fell silent. Because this was no longer a matter of legal maneuvering. This was a matter of accountability. and I shifted my attention back to her. "Why?" I asked. Just one word. But it carried everything, because that was the question that mattered. Not what happened, not how much was owed, but why. And I watched her struggle with it, her fingers tightening, her shoulders tensing, her breathing becoming just slightly uneven. And when she finally spoke, her voice lacked the sharpness it once had. "It was just easier," she said. And those words, those simple, careless words, they echoed in my mind in a way that few things do. Easier. As if that justified it. As if convenience could excuse exploitation. And I felt something inside me settle into a cold, unyielding clarity. Because I have heard many reasons in my courtroom. Desperation, fear, survival. But rarely, so rarely, do I hear someone admit that their actions were driven purely by convenience. And I leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping. Quieter, but heavier. Easier. For you, I said slowly. And she didn't respond. She couldn't. Because the truth of that statement left no room for defense. I remember thinking then about the man whose name filled those pages, 86 years old, blind, someone who by every reasonable measure depended on others, trusted others. And I could not help but wonder, did he know? Did he understand what was being done in his name? Or was he simply another silent victim of someone else's entitlement? And I asked the question, does he know about these tickets? And her reaction, it was immediate, a flicker of something, guilt, discomfort, something real, and she shook her head, just slightly. No, she admitted, and the room seemed to shift again, deeper this time, heavier, because now, we were no longer dealing with negligence. We were dealing with deception, and I felt my jaw tighten, not out of anger alone, but out of something stronger, something rooted in principle, because there are lines that should never be crossed, and exploiting someone who cannot see, who cannot even fully comprehend what is being done in their name, that is one of them. And I leaned back again, my eyes never leaving her. So he is unaware that his name has been used repeatedly to avoid responsibility, I said, not as a question, but as a statement, because that is what it was. And she nodded again, slower this time, as if each movement carried weight she could no longer ignore. The victim, though not present in the room at that moment, began to take shape in my mind, not as a name on paper, but as a person, someone who had lived a long life, who had reached an age where the world itself becomes more uncertain, where trust becomes both necessary and dangerous. And I could almost see him, sitting somewhere